The galaxy was vast, filled with stars, planets, and civilizations of unimaginable diversity. Some worlds were peaceful havens, where species lived in harmony with their environments, cultivating knowledge, culture, and diplomacy. Others were dangerous, hostile, or chaotic, shaped by the harshness of their surroundings. Among these, the Deathworlders were perhaps the most feared. They were creatures unlike any other, adapted to survive on planets where nothing else could live. Their bodies were strong, resilient, and nearly indestructible. Their minds were sharp, trained for strategy and battle from birth, and their society had no room for weakness. To outsiders, the Deathworlders seemed ruthless, detached, and almost inhuman. They did not intervene in the affairs of other species unless it served their own code of survival or tested their limits in a way that intrigued them. Humans, by contrast, were young in the grand scheme of the galaxy. For centuries, they had struggled to survive on Earth, a world of moderate danger but full of unpredictable challenges. Humanity's history was a record of resilience, wars, natural disasters, and countless hardships had shaped them into a species that refused to give up, no matter how dire the circumstances. When humans ventured into space, many other civilizations underestimated them. They seemed fragile, weak, and inexperienced, but humanity had a secret, a stubborn ingenuity that allowed them to adapt, learn, and overcome challenges that would have destroyed others. Their ships were not always the most advanced, but their crews could think on their feet, innovate under pressure, and find solutions that more powerful species often overlooked. It was in this context that the distress message arrived. The plea came from a species known to the galaxy as the Varelians had once been a dominant civilization in their region, technologically advanced and feared by nearby worlds. Their cities floated above oceans of strange gases, shimmering with light and advanced architecture. They had fleets, weapons, and knowledge that rivaled most civilizations of their size. But all of that meant nothing when faced with a coalition of aggressors determined to wipe them out. The Varelians had miscalculated their enemies, underestimated their ruthlessness, and now their civilization was on the edge of collapse. Their message reached human space through channels that were usually quiet, an encrypted call for help that spoke of desperation, fear, and a last chance to survive. Humans were surprised to receive the message. They had not had much contact with the Varelians, but they understood the urgency immediately. The plea was not one of pride or protocol. It was raw, emotional, and frightening. It described entire cities under siege, populations fleeing, and fleets being destroyed. The Varelians admitted their vulnerability openly, something few species ever did, especially not one that had once been considered powerful. That humans knew that if they did not act, the Varelians could be wiped out completely. But the challenge was more complex than simply sending aid. The coalition threatening the Varelians was not small, and they were ruthless. Any direct interference could trigger wider conflict. Humans had to think carefully, balancing urgency with strategy. It was then that the idea of involving the Deathworlders arose. No species could match the Deathworlders' skill and power in combat, and their very presence was often enough to tip the balance in a conflict. But convincing the Deathworlders to act was another matter entirely. They did not respond to pleas or negotiations in the way most species did. They operated on a different code, guided by principles of strength, challenge, and survival. They did not intervene for mercy, pity, or diplomacy alone. Humans realized that they would need to appeal to the Deathworlders in a language they understood, showing not only the seriousness of the situation but also why involvement might interest them. Preparations began quietly. Humans reviewed the intelligence they had about the Varelians' plight. They studied the coalition threatening them, mapping out forces, strategies, and weaknesses. Every detail mattered. They also gathered everything they could about the Deathworlders, their history, patterns of behavior, and previous interventions in galactic affairs. They had to find a way to present the situation in a way that resonated with these beings who had no interest in politics, morality, or sentiment. Humans realized that the Varelian survival alone would not be enough. The Deathworlders had to see the scenario as a challenge, a test of their abilities, or something that engaged their principles in a way that made action not only logical but appealing. Time was critical. Reports indicated that the coalition would begin its final assault soon. The Varelians' defenses were stretched thin, and their fleets were already taking losses. Entire cities were being evacuated, sometimes too late to save everyone. Images from orbital sensors and clandestine surveillance painted a grim picture. Fires sweeping across urban centers, defensive drones exploding in the skies, civilians running through ruined streets, and chaos spreading across what had once been a thriving civilization. The humans understood that failure was not an option. If the Varelians were destroyed, it would not only be a humanitarian tragedy but could destabilize the region, embolden other aggressive forces, and set a precedent that even humans themselves could eventually face. Despite the danger, the humans felt a strange mixture of awe and fear when considering the Deathworld. These beings were not known for empathy, yet their abilities were legendary. Entire fleets had been defeated when even a single Deathworlder ship entered a battlefield. Their tactics were precise, their combat instincts unmatched, and their endurance near mythological. If they could be convinced to act, They could end the conflict before the Varelians were completely overwhelmed. The question was how to reach them, how to frame the situation, and how to ensure that they saw a reason to intervene. It was a delicate dance between persuasion, strategy, and understanding an entirely alien mindset. Humans began a campaign of subtle influence. Messages were sent through channels that Deathworlders monitored, not official diplomatic transmissions, but carefully designed signals that conveyed the seriousness of the threat, the potential for a challenge, and hints at the opportunity for action. Humans avoided desperation, knowing that weakness would be ignored or dismissed. Instead, they focused on the facts. The Varelians were cornered, the coalition's forces were significant, and the situation required decisive action. They highlighted the scale of the threat in ways that would resonate with beings who respected power, efficiency, and strategic brilliance. It was a careful balancing act. Too much persuasion could seem manipulative. Too little would fail to convey the urgency. Meanwhile, humans prepared contingencies for every possible outcome. They coordinated with Varelian survivors to gather intelligence, secure supply routes, and identify evacuation points. They simulated potential scenarios, mapping out every possible strategy the coalition could employ and how the Deathworlders' intervention could change the dynamics. It was meticulous, detailed work, and it required patience, precision, and creativity. Humans knew that an action could be catastrophic, but they also understood that even with the Deathworlders' involvement, outcomes were never guaranteed. The galaxy had a way of reminding everyone that even the strongest beings were not invincible as the deadline approached. The humans' anticipation grew. They monitored every signal, every communication, and every movement across multiple systems. The Varelians were fighting for their lives, and the coalition was relentless. Humans could feel the tension in every intercepted transmission and every piece of intelligence. They understood the weight of what was happening. If the Deathworlders did not act, an entire civilization could vanish in a matter of hours, leaving nothing but ruin. At the same time, they knew that convincing the Deathworlders was as much a matter of psychology as strategy. These were not beings moved by empathy alone. They responded to logic, opportunity, and the thrill of challenge. Finally, after days of careful planning and communication, the stage was set. Humans had provided the Deathworlders with all the information needed to make a decision. They had shown the threat, the stakes, and the strategic potential. Now all they could do was wait and hope that the appeals had struck the right chord. For humans, this was a moment of tension, awe, and humility. They were dealing with forces far beyond their usual experience. Forces that could decide the fate of a civilization in ways humans could barely comprehend. The galaxy, vast and unpredictable, had suddenly become intensely personal. In the midst of this tension, the Varelians continued to resist. Their people fought with courage, desperation, and ingenuity. Civilians were moved to safer zones, fleets attempted daring maneuvers, and defenders held what positions they could. Every victory was small but hard-earned. Every loss was devastating. Through it all, humans observed, advised, and coordinated. But they knew that the tipping point depended on the Deathworlders' decision. The very survival of the Varelians now rested on the intervention of beings whose motives were inscrutable, whose power was unmatched, and whose timing could change the course of history. As hours turned into days, the humans remained vigilant. The galaxy felt tense, every system on edge. The Deathworlders, mysterious and detached, seemed almost like a force of nature rather than conscious beings, waiting, observing, and deciding. And then, in the midst of this uncertainty, humans held on to hope. They knew that if the Deathworlders acted, the Varelians could survive. If not, a civilization could disappear forever. A stark reminder of the harshness of the cosmos. In this moment, humans understood something fundamental. Survival in the galaxy was never guaranteed. It required courage, ingenuity, and sometimes, the ability to appeal to forces far beyond one's control. The Varelians' plea had set in motion a chain of events that would test alliances, challenge expectations, and reveal the hidden strengths of unlikely partners. And in that tense, uncertain space between hope and despair, humanity realized that they were no longer mere observers. They were active participants in a drama that could shape the galaxy itself. The Varelian situation was worsening by the hour. Their fleets, once symbols of pride and power, had been shattered piece by piece. Their cities, glittering jewels suspended in the skies above their homeworlds, were now shadows of what they once were. With smoke rising from burning districts and the sound of explosions echoing through the atmosphere, panic had begun to spread among the population. Civilians fled in every direction, desperate to find safety, yet finding little of it. The coalition forces attacking them were organized, merciless, and seemingly unstoppable. Every attempt to fight back was met with overwhelming force, and the Varelians were rapidly losing ground. The humans who were observing from a distance knew that if the trend continued, there would be nothing left to save. Humans had been working tirelessly to coordinate what help they could offer. Their ships, though less advanced than some civilizations, were agile and clever, capable of executing maneuvers that were almost impossible to predict. But even humans understood the limits of their influence. The coalition forces were far too numerous and powerful for humans alone to make a decisive difference. They needed allies, and they needed someone who could turn the tide with sheer force and precision. That ally was the Death. The humans had spent days sending messages, showing images of the devastation, and explaining the stakes. They had shared every detail of the conflict, carefully avoiding desperation, knowing that weakness would only dissuade the Deathworlders from action. Instead, they presented the situation as a challenge, a puzzle that required intelligence, skill, and timing qualities the Deathworlders respected above all. The challenge for humans was to convince beings who were nearly beyond comprehension in their logic and morality. The Deathworlders were not motivated by compassion. They did not care about alliances, friendships, or even the survival of weaker species, unless it somehow aligned with their principles or presented an opportunity to demonstrate their superiority. Humans had to think like them, understand what drove them, and present the Varelians' plight as a scenario worthy of their attention. It was a delicate balancing act. Any misstep could result in complete inaction, leaving the Varelians to face annihilation. Every communication was scrutinized, tested, and adjusted. Even the smallest detail could influence the outcome. Meanwhile, the Varelians were struggling to organize their defense. Their fleets, though diminished, still attempted daring sorties against the coalition forces. The skies above their homeworlds were filled with the flashing lights of energy weapons, the roar of engines, and the explosions of destroyed ships. The coalition attacked with precision, targeting key infrastructure, supply lines, and defensive positions. Each loss demoralized the Varelians further, yet they continued to fight with a combination of desperation and courage. The civilians, forced to evacuate, who relied on these brave defenders, knowing that without them, there would be no hope at all. Humans monitored every engagement, analyzing the tactics of both the Varelians and their attackers. They sent advice through encrypted channels, suggesting maneuvers, timing of retreats, and methods to maximize survival. The Varelians, though proud, understood the importance of these messages. They knew that humans had experience in situations where the odds were stacked against them, and that their strategies often focused on survival, innovation, and clever solutions. The humans' guidance helped the Varelians by crucial time, delaying the coalition's advance and preventing total collapse. Still, the pressure was immense. Every hour brought new losses, and the coalition showed no signs of slowing down. The humans' efforts to involve the Deathworlders continued. They sent signals, images, and intelligence packages designed to demonstrate the severity of the threat. They highlighted the coalition's size, coordination, and ruthlessness. They emphasized the complexity of the challenge, showing maps, battle plans, and detailed accounts of attacks that had already decimated the Varelian forces. Humans framed the situation in terms the Deathworlders would respect: strategy, risk, and opportunity. The goal was to present the conflict as something that was not only worthy of attention but also a test of skill and power. Something that a species like the Deathworlders could not ignore. As the humans worked, they began to notice subtle shifts in the responses from the Deathworlders. Though no direct communication was received, small movements in territories controlled by the Deathworlders suggested that their interest had been piqued. Scouts, patrols, and monitoring drones seemed to adjust their patterns, and unusual energy readings indicated that the Deathworlders were observing the situation more closely. Humans understood this as a sign that their careful planning was beginning to take effect. The Deathworlders were evaluating the scenario, calculating risks, and considering whether intervention would be worthwhile. That Varelian's desperation became more acute as the coalition began targeting civilian areas. Refugee zones were hit, evacuation corridors were blocked, and supply lines were destroyed. The population faced starvation, exposure, and constant bombardment. Hospitals, shelters, and emergency facilities were overwhelmed. The Varelians had to make difficult choices: which areas to defend, which to abandon, and how to prioritize the survival of civilians versus the protection of strategic locations. Each decision was a gamble, and each gamble had consequences. The humans, watching from afar, felt the weight of these choices. They knew that the survival of an entire civilization depended on the careful orchestration of intelligence, strategy, and timely intervention. The coalition forces, sensing the Varelians' weakening position, intensified their attacks. They adapted to every defensive maneuver, anticipating the Varelians' responses with uncanny accuracy. Skirmishes that once favored the defenders now ended in disaster. Key leaders were captured or killed, supply convoys destroyed, and defensive installations reduced to rubble. The Varelians' morale began to falter. Panic spread among the troops, and fear gripped the civilian population. The situation was dire, and hope seemed to be slipping away. Humans continued their efforts, knowing that their influence alone could not save the Varelians. They refined every message to the Deathworlders, emphasizing urgency, complexity, and opportunity. They included evidence of the coalition's arrogance, overconfidence, and mistakes, showing that victory was possible with the right intervention. They highlighted the Varelians' resilience, bravery, and ingenuity, framing the scenario as a challenge that could appeal to the Deathworlders' respect for strength and skill. Humans understood that the Deathworlders responded to mastery, challenge, and the chance to assert their power in a meaningful way. The message had to convey all of this without appearing weak, desperate, or pleading. The Varelians, despite the mounting losses, continued to fight with ingenuity. Small teams executed daring raids, sabotaging coalition supply lines and striking at critical command centers. Civilians adapted, creating hidden shelters, escape routes, and improvised defenses. Every victory was small but meaningful, giving hope that survival was still possible. Humans documented these actions, highlighting them in communications to the Deathworld. They framed these acts of courage as signs that the Varelians were not helpless, that their struggle was worthy of attention, and that the intervention of a powerful ally could turn the tide decisively. Time continued to slip away. The coalition was relentless. The Varelians were exhausted, and humans faced the daunting task of holding the line of hope until the Deathworlders could be convinced to act. They knew that any delay could result in catastrophe. Every message, every signal, and every maneuver was calculated to maintain pressure, convey urgency, and demonstrate opportunity. Humans also began preparing for contingencies, evacuation plans, escape routes, and last-minute defensive strategies. They had to be ready for every scenario, because even the Deathworlders' intervention was not guaranteed. Then, a turning point emerged. Humans detected a pattern in the Deathworlders' observation. Small deployments of scouts and reconnaissance ships began to shift closer to the conflict zone. Signals indicated that their interest was growing, and that they were beginning to calculate the implications of intervention. Humans understood that the Deathworlders were weighing risks, opportunities, and challenges, and that their decision could come at any moment. This knowledge brought both hope and anxiety. The possibility of salvation was real, but there was no certainty, and every passing hour increased the stakes for the Varelians. The humans continued to coordinate with the Varelians, providing guidance, strategic advice, and support wherever possible. They helped prioritize which cities and fleets could be saved, which defenses were most critical, and how to maximize survival with limited resources. They also prepared detailed reports for the Deathworlders, presenting scenarios that highlighted both the challenge and the reward of intervention. Every detail mattered, from the placement of defensive units to the potential outcomes of battles yet to come. Humans understood that precision, timing, and clarity were essential to convince the Deathworlders to act decisively. The Varelians' courage remained remarkable. Despite facing overwhelming odds, they continued to fight for their homes, families, and future. Their fleets executed daring maneuvers, their scientists devised improvised weapons, and their civilians showed resilience in the face of chaos. Every day was a struggle, every night a test of endurance and hope. Humans observed with admiration, knowing that the Varelians' perseverance was not just survival instinct, it was a testament to the strength of a civilization determined to endure. As the final assaults approached, the tension reached its peak. Humans, Varelians, and coalition forces all moved with precision, anticipation, and fear. Every action could tip the balance of the conflict. Humans knew that their careful preparation and communication with the Deathworlders had set the stage for intervention, but the outcome was still uncertain. The coalition was powerful, aggressive, and ruthless. The Varelians were brave, inventive, and desperate. The humans were calculating, patient, and determined. And the Deathworlders, distant and enigmatic, were observing, evaluating, and deciding whether the challenge presented to them was worthy of their unparalleled skill. In this moment, the galaxy seemed to hold its breath. The Varelians' survival hung by a thread. The humans' strategy and influence were critical, but ultimately, the decision rested with the Deathworlders. Every movement, every signal, every calculation mattered. The stage was set for a confrontation that could decide not only the fate of the Varelians, but the balance of power in the surrounding sectors. Humans understood that this was more than a battle, it was a test of courage, intelligence, and the ability to influence forces far beyond their control. And so, the rising challenge continued, building tension, testing alliances, and stretching the limits of endurance. The Varelians fought desperately, humans worked tirelessly, and the Deathworlders watched silently, their decision looming like a shadow over the conflict. Every moment brought new challenges, every choice carried consequences, and every heartbeat was a reminder that the stakes could not have been higher. The galaxy had become a theater of survival, strategy, and suspense, and the outcome remained uncertain, awaiting the intervention that could change everything. The galaxy had reached a tipping point. The Varelians, already battered and broken in many ways, faced the most desperate hours of their history. Their fleets were shadows of what they had once been, but they still moved with determination, refusing to surrender to the overwhelming might of the coalition forces. Every defensive maneuver had been calculated to buy time. Every strike meant to delay the inevitable. Yet, as the coalition closed in, their tactics became increasingly aggressive. Striking deeper into the heart of the Varelian homeworlds, entire districts burned in blazing infernos, leaving trails of smoke that stretched for hundreds of kilometers into the sky. The sound of explosions, alarms, and frantic evacuation measures created an atmosphere of chaos, panic, and fear. Even the most hardened soldiers felt the weight of hopelessness pressing down on them. Humans observed every movement with a mixture of awe and anxiety. They had prepared for this moment, gathering intelligence, sending communications, and planning contingencies. But nothing could fully replicate the experience of watching a civilization teeter on the edge of annihilation. They could see the desperation in the Varelians' actions, the small victories and ingenious tactics that were meant to keep the enemy at bay, the sacrifices made to save civilians, and the repeated attempts to preserve critical infrastructure. Each of these actions bought precious time, but it was clear to humans that even the most resilient efforts would not be enough without decisive intervention. The humans' communications with the Deathworlders had intensified. Every piece of intelligence, every strategy update, every observation of the Coalition's movements was sent in real time. Humans highlighted the precision and coordination of the Coalition forces, the increasing strain on Varelian defenses, and the potential for complete disaster if no action was taken. They framed the scenario as a challenge worthy of the Deathworld tension, emphasizing the strategic complexity, the necessity of skillful execution, and the opportunity for decisive action that could demonstrate their unmatched power. Humans were careful not to plead, not to show desperation, but to present the situation in a way that respected the Deathworlders' values and instincts. Meanwhile, the Coalition escalated their attacks. They began targeting evacuation routes, supply depots, and the remaining defensive stations. The skies were filled with energy beams, missile trails, and the wreckage of destroyed ships. The Varelians' attempts to counter these strikes were valiant but increasingly desperate. Pilots who had flown for decades were now fighting with a combination of precision and desperation, maneuvering through collapsing cityscapes and enemy fire with every ounce of skill they possessed. Civilians scrambled to makeshift shelters, often finding them destroyed or overcrowded. The human teams observing the battle could feel the tension mounting with every passing hour, knowing that the situation could collapse at any moment. As the pressure mounted, humans detected signs that the Deathworlders were finally moving closer to decisive observation. Scout ships had been deployed into nearby sectors. Energy readings indicated preparation for mobilization, and unusual patterns in patrol routes suggested an assessment of the conflict in progress. Humans understood the significance. The Death were evaluating the challenge directly, calculating risk, potential gains, and the complexity of intervention. This realization brought a cautious sense of hope. While nothing was guaranteed, it meant that the persuasive efforts had begun to bear fruit. The Deathworlders were watching, and that watchful eye could tip the balance in ways no other force could. The Varelians continued to fight with ingenuity. Small strike teams carried out daring raids against the Coalition's command structures, supply lines, and communication hubs. Engineers improvised weapons from the remnants of destroyed ships and facilities, using creativity and adaptability to hold off enemy forces. Civilians contributed where they could, assisting in repairs, evacuations, and intelligence gathering. Every victory was temporary, every loss devastating. But the relentless determination of the Varelians made the Coalition's progress slower than it could have been. Humans observed and documented these actions, emphasizing them in communications to the Deathworlders, framing the scenario as not merely a plea for intervention, but a worthy challenge that required strategic skill and power. Despite these small victories, the situation became increasingly critical when the Coalition began targeting the Varelians' remaining command centers. These hubs controlled fleets, communication networks, and critical defenses. Their destruction would mean complete disarray, leaving the Varelians scattered and vulnerable. The Coalition coordinated their attacks with ruthless efficiency, cutting off escape routes, isolating units, and targeting high-value assets with precision. Entire sectors of the Varelian homeworlds were engulfed in chaos, and the population's morale was slipping. Even the most disciplined soldiers faced the crushing weight of fear, fatigue, and the realization that survival was no longer guaranteed. Humans, understanding the stakes, increased their coordination with Varelian leaders. They provided guidance on tactical retreats, resource allocation, and prioritization of defensive positions. They advised on methods to maximize the effectiveness of their remaining forces, emphasizing ingenuity, speed, and calculated risks. Every maneuver was analyzed, every potential outcome mapped, and every adjustment made with the hope of prolonging the Varelians' survival until the Deathworlders could intervene. The humans knew that even a single hour gained in this way could mean the difference between total annihilation and a chance for rescue. The Deathworlders' presence began to make itself known indirectly. Sensor readings indicated the deployment of long-range monitoring systems near the Varelian sector. Subtle shifts in gravitational signatures suggested reconnaissance maneuvers, and unexplained energy fluctuations hinted at preparatory movements. Humans interpreted these signals as an indication that the Deathworlders were not only observing but actively assessing the operational environment. They were measuring the Coalition's strength, the Varelians' resilience, and the potential for a decisive strike. That humans knew that the final decision rested with the Deathworlders and that the outcome could be determined in a matter of hours. As the Coalition pressed their assault, the Varelians were forced into desperate measures. Evacuation convoys were reorganized, with civilians directed through hazardous routes while military units created temporary safe zones. Engineers constructed makeshift defenses, barricades and traps to slow the coalition's advance. Pilots flew dangerous sorties through heavily defended corridors, risking their lives to protect critical infrastructure and remaining population centers. The humans monitored these efforts closely, providing feedback, suggestions, and support wherever possible. The intensity of the conflict grew, and the stakes were higher than ever. The turning point in the escalation phase came when the coalition launched a concentrated assault on the Varelians' central command hub. This hub was the nerve center of the remaining defense, controlling communications, fleet coordination, and strategic oversight. Its destruction would leave the Varelians blind, disorganized, and vulnerable. Coalition forces attacked with overwhelming numbers. Energy shields shimmered and failed under repeated strikes, and the hub's defenses were battered to the brink of collapse. The Varelian commanders coordinated desperately, calling on every available resource, every pilot, every defensive installation to resist the assault. Humans could see the magnitude of the challenge. The Varelians were outmatched, and time was slipping away rapidly. In the midst of this chaos, humans detected the first direct signals of Deathworld immobilization. Massive energy readings indicated the movement of large vessels toward the conflict zone. Scouting units reported formations and patrol patterns that suggested an imminent intervention. The humans understood that the Deathworlders were preparing for a decisive strike, but there was no certainty about timing, method, or extent. The Varelians, unaware of the specifics, continued to fight with courage and desperation. Civilians were moved to safer zones where possible, though many remained trapped in the chaos of collapsing districts. Every action, every decision, carried the weight of life and death for thousands of individuals. As the critical moment approached, tension in the human observation and coordination teams reached its peak. Every communication, every signal, every movement of the coalition was analyzed, documented, and interpreted. The humans understood that this was more than a simple battle. It was a test of strategy, influence, and timing. If the Deathworlders acted correctly, they could save countless lives and shift the balance of power decisively. If they delayed, miscalculated, or refused intervention, the Varelian civilization could be destroyed. The humans held their breath, knowing that every second mattered, that every decision could ripple across the stars, and that the survival of an entire species hung in the balance. The Varelians, fighting with unmatched determination, carried out a series of daring operations in the final hours before the anticipated intervention. Small teams sabotaged enemy weapons systems. Pilots executed near-impossible maneuvers to delay the coalition's advance, and engineers improvised energy shields and temporary defensive installations. Every success was temporary but crucial, buying moments that could allow the Deathworlders to intervene at the right moment. That humans documented these feats, sending precise updates to Deathworlder observers, emphasizing the complexity, skill, and challenge of the scenario. Then, just as the coalition prepared for what seemed like the final decisive strike, signs of the Deathworlders' intervention became undeniable. Massive vessels appeared on sensor readings, moving with speed, precision, and power beyond anything the humans had witnessed firsthand. Energy signatures lit up the sector, indicating the deployment of advanced weaponry, shields, and tactical systems. Humans realized that the Deathworlders had decided to act. The very nature of the critical moment, the tipping point where all efforts and planning would either succeed or fail, had arrived. The initially unaware of the Deathworlders' presence, continued their desperate maneuvers, delaying the coalition as best they could. Then, as the Deathworlders' first strike hit with terrifying efficiency, the situation changed instantly. The coalition forces were caught off guard, their formations shattered, and their attacks disrupted by the overwhelming and precise power of the Deathworlders. What had seemed inevitably annihilation, collapse, and despair were suddenly thrown into uncertainty. The critical moment had arrived, a turning point that would determine the fate of the Varelians, the coalition, and the balance of power in the surrounding sectors. Humans watched, awestruck, as the Deathworlders executed maneuvers that combined intelligence, precision, and overwhelming force. Entire fleets were neutralized in moments, strategic positions reclaimed, and critical infrastructure protected. The Varelians, finally aware of the intervention, experienced a mixture of shock, relief, and renewed determination. What had once seemed like certain doom now had a chance of survival. The coalition, caught in the crossfire and overwhelmed by the efficiency of the death, began to retreat, recalibrate, and reconsider their objectives. In these critical hours, humans reflected on the delicate balance between preparation, strategy, and timing. Every effort to communicate, every piece of intelligence gathered, every tactical suggestion sent to the Varelians had contributed to creating this moment. The Deathworlders' intervention was not motivated by sentiment, but by respect for the challenge, the skill involved, and the opportunity to assert their unmatched power. Yet, without human preparation and guidance, the intervention might have been too late or misdirected. The critical moment demonstrated the power of collaboration, influence, and understanding forces beyond one's immediate control. The battle continued, but the tide had shifted. The Varelians fought alongside the Deathworlders, using their ingenuity and knowledge of their homeworlds to complement the intervention. Humans coordinated communications, ensuring that every maneuver was effective and synchronized. The coalition, now disorganized, faced defeat, confusion, and the realization that the challenge they had posed was far greater than anticipated. The critical moment had passed, and with it came the first glimmers of hope that survival, victory, and reconstruction were possible. The moment the Deathworlders entered the conflict, the entire dynamic of the battle shifted instantly. What had seemed like inevitable destruction for the Varelians became a turning point that would decide the fate of not only their civilization but the surrounding sectors. The Deathworlders moved with terrifying efficiency, their massive warships gliding through space with calculated precision. Their weapons were unlike anything the coalition forces had ever encountered: energy beams that sliced through the strongest shields, missiles that altered course mid-flight with unerring accuracy, and war machines capable of devastating entire fleets in seconds. Every strike was coordinated, every movement executed with flawless timing. Humans watched the unfolding events with a mixture of awe and relief, knowing that their strategic planning and influence had helped bring about this decisive intervention. At first shocked by the sudden arrival of the Deathworlders, quickly adapted. Their remaining fleets, though small and battered, began coordinating with the newcomers. Pilots and commanders who had been on the brink of despair now felt a renewed sense of purpose. The Deathworlders did not communicate in words as humans or Varelians did. Their actions were commands, their intentions clear through precision and overwhelming force. The Varelians learned quickly to follow these movements, adapting their own tactics to complement the Deathworlders' superior firepower and strategy. Together, they began to push back the coalition forces in ways that had previously seemed impossible. The coalition, initially confident in its overwhelming numbers and coordination, was thrown into chaos. Their forces had relied on predictable tactics and numerical advantage, but the Deathworlders' arrival shattered those assumptions instantly. Entire squadrons were destroyed before they could even execute maneuvers. Command centers were obliterated, and logistical networks collapsed under precise attacks. Coalition leaders were forced to rethink every move, but the speed and efficiency of the Deathworlders' strategy left them little time to respond. Panic and confusion spread through their ranks as soldiers and commanders realized that they were no longer fighting a vulnerable civilization but an unstoppable force of nature accompanied by resilient allies. Humans continued to observe, guide, and coordinate with the They provided crucial intelligence about enemy movements, suggested tactical adjustments, and relayed observations that helped synchronize the combined forces. Although the Deathworlders did not require human direction, they seemed to respond favorably to actions that optimized efficiency and reduced unnecessary risk. The humans' coordination ensured that the Varelians could play their part effectively without hindering the Deathworlders' overwhelming power. Every success built momentum, and with each destroyed enemy installation and fleet, the morale of the Varelians surged. The Deathworlders' intervention was ruthless but calculated. Entire fleet formations of the coalition were decimated with minimal collateral damage to Varelian cities and infrastructure. The precision of their attacks was terrifying, where an ordinary force would have caused indiscriminate destruction. The Deathworlders targeted critical systems, first command hubs, weapons platforms, and logistical centers. This methodical approach allowed the Varelians to retain their vital resources and evacuate civilians safely. Humans documented every maneuver, understanding that this combination of ruthless efficiency and strategic intelligence was what had prevented total annihilation. The coalition forces attempted desperate counterattacks, concentrating their firepower on smaller Deathworlder warships and attempting to lure them into traps. But the Deathworlders anticipated every move, countering attacks before they could gain momentum. Their ability to read, predict, and neutralize threats in real time was unmatched. In one striking example, a coalition fleet attempted to ambush a Varelian convoy fleeing a burning city. Before the coalition ships could strike, Deathworlder forces swept through the sector, neutralizing enemy vessels, clearing the path for civilians, and capturing critical enemy leaders for interrogation. The speed and decisiveness of these actions demoralized the coalition while inspiring awe in those who witnessed it. The humans marveled at the coordination between the Deathworlders and the remaining Varelian forces. Despite their limited numbers, the Varelians were able to leverage the Deathworlders' capabilities to maximum effect. Engineers worked alongside Deathworlder operatives to repair damaged systems in record time. Pilots coordinated strike patterns with Deathworlder formations, creating a lethal combination of speed, firepower, and tactical awareness. Even small Varelian units were able to take out enemy positions that would have required entire fleets before. The synergy between the two species transformed a desperate losing battle into a carefully controlled counteroffensive. As the battle progressed, the coalition began to retreat. Their losses mounted exponentially. Their fleets were shattered, and command structures were in disarray. Where once they had controlled the skies above the Varelian homeworlds, now they were forced to flee or surrender. The Deathworlders, ever precise ensured that their strikes were decisive without unnecessary destruction, leaving the Varelians' vital infrastructure intact. Humans coordinated intelligence to track retreating forces, anticipate potential regrouping attempts, and advise the Varelians on where to consolidate their defenses. The coalition's aggression had been halted, their momentum broken, and the balance of power had been completely reversed. The Varelians, though exhausted and traumatized, began to realize the extent of their salvation. Cities that had been on the brink of collapse were now secure. Civilian populations that had been trapped in burning districts were safely evacuated. Key command hubs, defensive stations, and fleets that had been nearly destroyed were intact, preserved through careful coordination and the Deathworlders' precise intervention. Humans and Varelians alike recognized that this was a victory not solely of firepower but of strategy, timing, and the ability to work alongside forces far more powerful than themselves. Even after the immediate threat had been neutralized, the Deathworlders continued to secure the region. They pursued remaining coalition forces, dismantling their supply chains, capturing stragglers, and ensuring that any potential for a renewed assault was eliminated. Their methods were swift and merciless, leaving no opportunity for retaliation. The humans observed these operations, noting the remarkable balance between efficiency and restraint. The Deathworlders' goal was not destruction for its own sake, but the establishment of control, stability, and the demonstration of their superiority. The Varelians began to rebuild, guided by the knowledge that they had survived because of the extraordinary intervention. They repaired damaged infrastructure, restored fleets, and reconstructed defensive systems. They also began to reflect on the magnitude of what had occurred. Their survival had been precarious, reliant on the intervention of beings they had once feared or dismissed. Humans facilitated communication, offering advice on rebuilding strategies, coordinating resources, and integrating new technologies that had been salvaged or captured during the conflict. The combined effort of humans and the Deathworlders created a foundation for recovery that no single species could have achieved alone. Humans also reflected on the lesson of collaboration, influence, and strategy. They had played a crucial role not by direct combat alone but by understanding, anticipating, and shaping the environment in which the Deathworlders could act most effectively. Their communications had highlighted the challenge, demonstrated the resilience of the Varelians, and provided intelligence that allowed for precise action. Humans realized that their ability to influence forces beyond their immediate control was as important as their own capabilities in combat. The galaxy had shown them that intelligence, preparation, and coordination could be just as powerful as raw strength. The Deathworlders, having completed their intervention, began to withdraw. They left behind a secure Varelian civilization, an intact infrastructure, and a coalition force decisively defeated. Their departure was as precise and enigmatic as their arrival. No unnecessary communication was exchanged. Their intentions and actions had spoken louder than words. The Varelians watched in awe, grateful and humbled by the intervention that had saved them. Humans understood the significance as well. This had been more than a rescue mission. It had been a demonstration of strategy, power, and the potential of interspecies collaboration under extraordinary circumstances. In the days following the intervention, humans helped coordinate the final stabilization of the Varelian homeworlds. They assisted in evacuating remaining civilians from hazardous zones, restoring essential services, and documenting damage for reconstruction. Engineers and scientists collaborated across species, sharing knowledge, repairing critical systems, and preparing defenses against any future threats. The coalition forces, now in retreat, were monitored to prevent regrouping or renewed aggression. Every action reinforced the hard-won victory and ensured that the sacrifices of the Varelians and the precision of the Deathworlders would not be in vain. The resolution of this conflict highlighted a fundamental truth. Even in the darkest moments, decisive action, careful planning, and the willingness to work with powerful allies could change the course of history. That Varelian civilization had faced near annihilation, yet through courage, ingenuity, and the intervention of the Deathworlders they had survived. Humans had played a subtle but critical role, demonstrating that understanding, strategy, and influence could make a difference even against seemingly insurmountable odds. The galaxy, for a brief moment, seemed to hold a fragile balance between destruction and survival, chaos and order, fear and hope. The aftermath of the battle left the Varelians forever changed. They had witnessed power unlike any they had encountered, learned the value of alliance and strategic coordination, and experienced the mercy of precision over brute force. Humans reflected on their own growth, understanding that their role in the galaxy was evolving. No longer were they simply observers or distant participants. They were strategists, mediators, and facilitators capable of shaping events in profound ways. The Deathworlders, enigmatic and powerful, had left an indelible mark not through words but through action, demonstrating the consequences of precision, intelligence, and uncompromising power. Even as reconstruction began, the galaxy would remember the events of this conflict, stories of the Varelians' near destruction, the Coalition's overreach, and the Deathworlders' overwhelming intervention spread among civilizations. The humans, often underestimated, were recognized as a species capable of insight, strategy, and influence beyond mere survival. The Varelians were built with newfound appreciation for the unpredictable alliances of the galaxy, honoring the intervention that had saved them. In the resolution of this conflict, the balance of power, the potential for cooperation, and the consequences of underestimating any species had become unmistakably clear by the time the last coalition forces had retreated, and the immediate threat had been neutralized. The Varelians could finally breathe. The cities were safe, fleets repaired, and civilians secure. Humans remained in contact, ensuring that rebuilding efforts progressed smoothly and that the lessons learned were incorporated into future defense strategies. The Deathworlders had departed, leaving only a lingering presence of awe, fear, and respect. What had begun as a desperate plea for help had ended in decisive action, a demonstration of unmatched skill, and the survival of an entire civilization. The Varelians had survived because of courage, collaboration, and the intervention of a force whose motivations were inscrutable yet precise. Humans had contributed through intelligence, strategy, and careful influence, proving that even in the shadow of the galaxy's most formidable beings, thought, preparation, and action could make a difference. The coalition forces had been defeated, their arrogance punished, and the balance of power in the sector restored. The resolution of this conflict became a story of survival, resilience, and the extraordinary potential that emerges when different species coordinate in the face of overwhelming odds. The dust of battle had finally settled, and the Varelians were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered world. The war that had threatened to wipe them from existence was over, but the echoes of its destruction reverberated through every city, every settlement, and every heart. Smoke still rose from districts that had been reduced to rubble, and the cries of those who had lost loved ones could be heard even amidst the cautious celebrations of survival. Yet, despite the overwhelming devastation, there was a sense of cautious hope in the air. The Varelians had survived, not through luck or chance, but through a combination of courage, ingenuity, and the intervention of forces far beyond their understanding. Humans remained close, offering assistance wherever it was needed. They helped rebuild critical infrastructure, repair communication networks, and restore essential services. They worked alongside the Varelians to establish secure supply lines and organize efforts to relocate civilians from hazardous areas. Engineers, scientists, and strategists collaborated, sharing knowledge that had been gathered from centuries of human experience in survival, adaptation, and innovation. That humans understood that their role had been subtle but crucial. They had helped shape the battlefield, coordinate defenses, and influence the intervention of the Deathworlders. Their guidance had ensured that when the decisive force arrived, the Varelians could make the most of the opportunity to survive. The Varelians themselves were changed in profound ways. The ordeal had stripped away arrogance and complacency, replacing it with humility, resilience, and a deep appreciation for life. They had witnessed power unlike anything in their history. The sheer might and precision of the Deathworlders and the strategic acumen of the humans who had coordinated the effort. Leaders reflected on the fragility of their civilization, recognizing that survival depended not only on strength but also on intelligence, foresight, and the ability to form alliances, even with those who seemed incomprehensible or frightening. The experience had forged a new understanding of their place in the galaxy, and a renewed determination to prepare for the future. Families reunited amidst the ruins, holding one another tightly, tears mingling with dust and ash. The emotional weight of survival was heavy, for many had lost loved ones, and for some, the loss was permanent. Children who had been evacuated from dangerous zones returned to see their homes partially destroyed but intact. Communities came together, sharing resources, supporting one another, and beginning the slow process of healing. Despite the trauma, there was a resilience in their hearts, a determination that the horrors they had endured would not define their future. Humans observed these reunions, quietly supporting recovery efforts, aware that their presence had helped tip the balance between life and death. The Varelians' fleets, once decimated, began to rebuild as well. Damaged ships were repaired, new vessels constructed, and strategies re-evaluated in light of the recent conflict. Pilots who had fought in desperate sorties were celebrated, their courage recognized, and their experiences incorporated into training programs for future generations. Every decision, every maneuver, every life saved became part of a broader understanding of what it meant to survive and thrive in a galaxy filled with dangers and unpredictability. Humans contributed advice on fleet organization, tactical doctrines, and contingency planning, drawing from their own long history of facing seemingly insurmountable challenges. The coalition forces, whose arrogance and overconfidence had led to their defeat, were monitored closely. Their remaining fleets had been scattered and their command structures severely disrupted. Humans and Varelians collaborated to track these remnants, ensuring that they could not regroup and launch another attack. While some sought to flee the sector entirely, others were captured, interrogated, or neutralized to prevent future threats. The balance of power had shifted decisively, and the galaxy began to recognize that the Varelians were no longer as vulnerable as they had once seemed. This shift, however, was tempered with humility. for the Varelians knew that their survival had been contingent on the intervention of the Deathworlders, beings of incomprehensible power who had acted not out of empathy, but because the situation had presented a worthy challenge. The humans reflected on the larger implications of the conflict. They had been observers, mediators, and strategists, influencing the outcome through intelligence, preparation, and careful communication. Their role had demonstrated that survival in the galaxy was not only about physical strength or technological superiority, but also about understanding, adaptation, and the ability to work with forces beyond one's immediate control. The experience highlighted the delicate balance between action and patience, influence and observation, and the importance of seizing the right moment to act. Humans had learned lessons about diplomacy, strategy, and the unpredictable consequences of interstellar interventional lessons that would shape their approach to future conflicts and alliances. The Death, having completed their decisive intervention, withdrew from the Varelian sector without ceremony. Their presence lingered as a reminder of their power, their precision, and their inscrutable motives. They left behind no messages, no declarations, only the results of their actions. The Varelians, awed and humbled, could only reflect on the enormity of what had occurred. They had survived because a species unlike any other had chosen to intervene. Recognizing the challenge, the complexity, and the stakes, humans understood the significance of this. Knowing that the Deathworlders' involvement had been the turning point that allowed the Varelians to endure, the aftermath of the battle extended beyond the physical reconstruction. The Varelians began to reconsider their place in the galaxy, their relationships with neighboring civilizations, and the lessons they could draw from their near destruction. They recognized that survival depended not only on internal strength but also on the ability to anticipate threats, forge alliances, and adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. Humans provided guidance on these strategic and philosophical considerations, emphasizing the importance of foresight, intelligence, and collaboration. The Varelians, in turn, began to integrate these insights into their governance, military planning, and societal structures. As reconstruction progressed, a sense of reflection emerged. Communities rebuilt not only their physical environments but also their collective psyche. Leaders held councils to discuss the lessons of the conflict. Young generations were taught the stories of courage, strategy, and survival, and the society as a whole began to internalize the significance of alliances and foresight. Humans participated in these discussions, offering perspectives that combined historical insight with practical experience, helping the Varelians understand the broader implications of the conflict and the responsibilities that came with surviving such a catastrophic threat. Cultural changes began to take shape as well. Art, literature, and media reflected the experiences of the past months, depicting the courage of civilians and soldiers, the horrors of war, and the awe-inspiring presence of the Deathworld. Songs and stories celebrated survival, honor, and the lessons of strategy and intelligence. Humans observed these cultural shifts, recognizing that they reflected a deep and enduring understanding of the experiences that had nearly destroyed a civilization. The Varelians' collective memory would now carry the lessons of resilience, adaptation, and the unpredictable consequences of galactic politics. Of Varelians' gratitude toward the humans and, indirectly, the Deathworlders was profound. Humans had not acted as saviors in the conventional sense. Rather, they had orchestrated, coordinated, and influenced events in ways that allowed the intervention to be decisive. They had demonstrated the power of understanding, patience, and strategic action. The Varelians, humbled by the scale of the forces at play, recognized the unique role humans had played in shaping the outcome. This recognition laid the foundation for a lasting alliance, one built not only on shared survival but also on mutual respect, trust, and the understanding of capabilities beyond immediate comprehension. Human reflection deepened as well. They had witnessed firsthand the importance of preparation, communication, and strategic thinking in influencing events far beyond their own immediate reach. They had learned that in a galaxy filled with civilizations of immense power and unpredictable motives, survival and success depended on more than brute force. Intelligence, adaptability, and the ability to anticipate the actions of others, especially those whose logic was alien, were as critical as any weapon or fleet. The humans recognized that their role in the galaxy was evolving, from a species struggling to survive to one capable of shaping events, influencing outcomes, and facilitating the survival of entire civilizations. The Varelians' recovery was gradual but steady. Essential infrastructure was repaired, fleets were reconstructed, and defensive systems strengthened. The coalition forces were contained, their remnants monitored, and the region stabilized. Civilian populations began returning to their homes, reclaiming territory that had been ravaged by the conflict. The trauma of war lingered, but the experience had instilled resilience, adaptability, and a profound appreciation for life and survival. Humans continued to provide guidance, sharing knowledge, strategic insights, and historical lessons from their own civilization, further strengthening the Varelians' capacity for long-term stability and preparedness. As months passed, reflection became a cornerstone of Varelian society. Memorials were erected for those who had been lost, and stories of heroism and ingenuity were passed down through generations. The experiences of the conflict, the intervention of the Deathworlders, and the subtle yet critical role of humans were commemorated and studied. Scholars, strategists, and leaders drew lessons from the crisis, ensuring that the knowledge gained would inform future decisions, military planning, and diplomatic relations. Humans remained partners in this reflection, helping to frame events in a broader galactic context, emphasizing patterns, consequences, and opportunities for growth. The Varelians also began to look outward, considering their relationships with neighboring civilizations and their place in the galaxy. They realized that isolation, arrogance, and underestimation of threats had brought them to the brink of annihilation. The lessons of humility, preparation, and cooperation were ingrained deeply. Humans provided counsel on interstellar diplomacy, alliance building, and contingency planning, helping the Varelians navigate a galaxy filled with unpredictable powers and competing interests. The near destruction of their civilization became a catalyst for transformation, shaping a society that would be stronger, wiser, and more resilient in the future. Even the younger generations, who had experienced the conflict only as a terrifying reality, absorbed the lessons of courage, resilience, and collaboration. They were taught to value strategic thinking, critical observation, and the ability to anticipate and respond to challenges. The stories of the Deathworlders' intervention, humans' coordination, and the Varelians' ingenuity were passed down as essential elements of their cultural identity. These lessons would guide future leaders, innovators, and citizens in a galaxy that remained as dangerous, unpredictable, and full of opportunity as ever. The aftermath and reflection of the conflict solidified several truths. Survival in the galaxy was never guaranteed, but it was possible through courage, ingenuity, strategic action, and collaboration. The Varelians had survived not simply through force, but through the coordinated efforts of humans, the precise intervention of the Deathworlders, and their own resilience. The humans had learned that influence, preparation, and timing could be as decisive as any weapon, and the Deathworlders had demonstrated the unparalleled power that comes from precision, skill, and adherence to one's principles. As peace gradually returned to the Varelian sector, the galaxy seemed to hold a collective breath, reflecting on the consequences of the conflict. Stories of the near destruction of the Varelians, the coalition's arrogance, and the intervention of the Deathworlders spread across star systems. Humans, once underestimated, were recognized for their unique ability to influence events and coordinate complex interventions. The Varelians emerged from the crisis changed, wiser, and more capable of defending themselves in the future. The Deathworlders, distant and enigmatic, remained a force to be reckoned with, their presence a constant reminder of power, precision, and the consequences of challenge. Both humans and Varelians understood the fragility of life, the value of foresight, and the importance of alliances. The galaxy had tested them, and through courage, intelligence, and decisive action, they had emerged alive, vigilant, and more prepared for whatever challenges might arise next. The aftermath of the conflict became a story of resilience, strategy, and hope, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, survival is possible when courage, ingenuity, and the right allies converge in perfect timing.